You're tuning into the Active Mom Podcast with physical therapist, Dr. Carrie Pagliano, a real mom's guide to all things postpartum return to workouts after baby. If you're a postpartum mom, coach, trainer, or physical therapist looking for answers on how to get back to running, CrossFit, yoga, Pilates, HIIT, you name it, without the fear of pelvic floor issues or doing something wrong, this is the podcast for you. Let's start the show. All right. If you've had a kid or work with moms who've had kids over the last several years with the rise in social media, you know there's this whole issue of the comparison game. Whether it's just, diapers, preschool, like breastfeeding, or if you've gone down the rabbit hole of pelvic floor health, that's a whole nother animal. But there was a study that hit the media recently looking at comparison, idealized motherhood on social media. And so I reached out to the author and I was like, hey, we need to chat because that's definitely a concern. And she agreed to come on. CIERA KIRKPATRICK, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Mom Postpartum Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
All right. You are a mom yourself. Tell me who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Yeah, that sounds great. So like you said, I'm CIERA KIRKPATRICK. I'm originally from Wichita, Kansas, but I'm currently at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm a professor of advertising and public relations. But a big part of my job is studying how messages in the media, whether that be social media, advertising, news stories, how that affects people in terms of outcomes related to their mental and physical health. So most recently, I've been studying this phenomenon of how motherhood is portrayed on social media and what effects that has on us new moms. And I became really interested in this myself when I became a mom, and I realized that the media was influencing me. And so I became a mom in May of 2020, so right at the height of the pandemic. And it was a rough time, but it really kind of fueled my passion for this research and made me want to make a difference for all of the moms out there.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I always tell people my kids are 10 and 13. And so we barely would post little things on Facebook. It wasn't the Instagram generation. And I'm so glad I did not have to or feel pressured to raise my kids and report on it by the moment. So let's go back. Let's do research first, and then let's kind of talk about your scenario. And then you're also due soon, so you've kind of been able to navigate this outside the odd bubble of a global pandemic. What were some of the things that you were kind of looking at as far as particular posts and things that impacted moms?
Yeah. So as I became a mother myself and I was, looking up things online and following certain people on social media, I was having a lot of motherhood content just show up on, my Instagram, my Facebook feeds. And I started to notice that so much of it just seemed so overly positive in terms of what motherhood is like. And, it was very glamorized in a sense. And once I actually had my child and then was in the thick of it, I realized oh my gosh, this content is even more unrealistic than I thought. So I was finding that what I was seeing online was really influencing how I thought motherhood was supposed to be. And my own personal experience wasn't lining up to that. Prior to this realization, I had actually done some research with my advisor when I was a PhD student, looking at body image on Instagram. And I think, that's pretty well known that there's a problem there too, and that people kind of distort their physical appearance online. And we make comparisons in terms of that too, like how our body looks compared to somebody else's. And that can have really detrimental effects in terms of how we feel about ourselves. So then it was kind of like this aha moment of wow, what's happening with the body image culture is happening here with motherhood as well. So there's this glamorization that influences the comparisons that we're making, and then ultimately leads us to feel like we're not doing a good enough job as a mom. So, the content where the mothers and the child are just super happy, super put together. They're in these $1 million homes. the mom showing off, her daughter's bedroom that has not one, but two walk-in closets. Cause you've got to have, the closet of everyday clothes and then the closet of dress up clothes and, a little spa station in their bathroom. And the kids never upset or having any difficulties. They're reaching all of their milestones. And it can be really hard if that's the only thing you're seeing. And that's kind of becoming your expectation of your own motherhood experience.
Now, I think there's been a little shift since back then, a little more reality. But if we go back to kind of that glamorization, we not only were seeing that with like influencers becoming moms, or people that became influencers as moms, but then also like the average person too, I think felt some degree of need to portray that. And I think, we, especially back in the, the beginning of the pandemic, when people weren't together, this is what you could put out into the universe.
Yes.
So was there a difference between how moms responded to an influencer versus just the average person?
This is such an important part. So my very first study in this area looked at the difference between content that was idealized and then content that wasn't idealized, so the content that was more realistic. And then in addition to that, I was looking at whether or not there was a difference between influencers sharing those two different types of posts and then everyday mothers. So, just someone like me posting. And what was really, really interesting to find was that idealized content, regardless of if it was coming from an influencer or an everyday mother, increased feelings of state anxiety and envy. So it doesn't matter. Like, we can't just be like, oh, well, they're an influencer. Even if, I'm always posting just content, that can be harmful. And part of the reason for that, from like a research theoretical perspective, is that we make stronger comparisons to the people who are more like us. So in my study, we actually found that people compare more to the mothers who are like them rather than the influencers. And that's because we do have more in common with them. We aren't comparing in terms of, thinking about the different lifestyle they have. They may have more money. They may not have to work. They have these extra resources. So they're different from us. They're not as relevant in comparison. But when the everyday mothers who are very similar to us are idealizing motherhood, then it can be really harmful. Another interesting thing too is that this type of comparison phenomenon in motherhood isn't new with social media.
No.
So back in the day, like, there were mommy bloggers or like mommy profiles, celebrity mom profiles in magazines. And so like the same type of thing was happening where people were comparing their experiences to these celebrity moms. But it was a lot different then because, you don't always have a magazine in your hand, right? Whereas we always have our phone and social media right there, super accessible. So when I'm awake with my child at 3 a.m., feeding him in the nursery, I can easily scroll on my phone and be exposed to all these idealized images and videos. And social media makes it easier for everyday mothers to post that content too. So it's just kind of really become a bigger phenomenon in a way.
Yeah. No, I feel like, I'm trying to think back because we, I wasn't posting about my kids on Instagram back then, like, but was that comparison there at the playground or at the mommy and me groups? And I think to some degree it was, but the dosage was different.
Yeah.
It was like this girl that you knew was in the class and her kid, and she happened to look cute today and they're totally, like coordinated outfits or things like that. But it wasn't in as much excess as it is now. That might be 1 hour a week versus, like you said, you're scrolling at dark 30 in the morning and your baby's crying and, you're tired and you're there for hours. And like, I think the dosage is incredibly different now than before.
Exactly.
So what were kind of the things that you were looking at with the moms? Was it, I know you had kind of spoken a little bit about self-esteem or comparison or things like that. What were some of the questions that you were asking them to assess?
Yeah. So in that first study, when we were looking at the idealized versus non-idealized and the influencers versus everyday moms, we were looking at how much they were comparing to them and then how that influenced their levels of envy and state anxiety. And then in the second study, which just recently was published, we wanted to dive a little bit more into this in terms of seeing whether or not certain mothers are more susceptible to being harmed by this type of content than others. So for that, we were doing the same thing where we were exposing them to these real images taken from Instagram portraying motherhood, some idealized, some not. But we were looking to see if the effects of the idealized post were more harmful when a mother is low in self-esteem or high in social comparison orientation. So what that means ultimately is all of us as humans, we make social comparisons. It's just an innate human trait. It's how we measure ourselves up to other people as a way of evaluating ourselves. But some people are more inclined to make social comparisons than others. So for some of us, those comparisons we make happen more often and they mean more to us and have more of an influence. So we wanted to see, okay, those moms who are very high in terms of their tendency to make social comparisons, are they more likely to be harmed by these posts? And we found that the idealized posts do harm these mothers more in terms of their perceived parental competence. So ultimately how they feel about their abilities themselves as a mother. For these moms who are inclined to make more comparisons to other mothers, they're more likely to see these idealized posts and then have those posts lower their own perceptions of how they're doing as a parent, which obviously is not great, right? Like it's hard enough already to feel like we're doing a good enough job. And so for those mothers especially, it can reduce those feelings of how good we are as a parent. We didn't find a difference in terms of self-esteem, which I think is a good thing. But I think there's still a little more to dig into there too. It may have just been the fact that the posts like weren't considered relevant for them. Like I said, you have to perceive the person that you're comparing to as somewhat similar or relevant as a comparison target, or else you're not going to compare to them.
Matter.
Not going to matter. But this really just shows us like some mothers are more likely to be harmed, which helps us from like a clinical standpoint of being able to recognize like, okay, we need to pay attention to certain moms, especially because they're more likely to be harmed by this.
So how were you able to identify who those moms were? And because I'm trying to pull back and be like, all right, are these people that we're going to screen out early on and say, hey, you're susceptible to this. This is something you need to be aware of because we don't want to set you up to be in a harmful situation or a situation where you don't feel as good about yourself. Like what are the ways that you guys, or the tools that you guys use to assess that?
Yeah, so we had 464 new moms in our study. And before they went into like the experimental portion where they were shown all of these different posts, they responded to questions that helped us to measure their social comparison orientation. So basically, it's different items like how likely are you to compare your child's progress to another mother's child's progress. There's all these different items that help to kind of get an indication of how valuable social comparisons are to them and how much they partake in them. And so we're able to ask that ahead of time and then kind of figure out how these moms should be grouped in terms of having a low social comparison orientation or a high orientation. And it's really just a scale of less than 10 items that, they just rate their agreement with. And then we're able to use that. And so what I would really love to see, down the road, now that these findings are coming out, is that health professionals use these same measures. When you go to your child's wellness checks in those early months, you're often answering questions that measure your postpartum depression, and being able either during that phase or in the prenatal phase to also answer questions that help health professionals to understand your social comparison orientation could help give them a heads up as to who they should be paying extra attention to, who might be most vulnerable.
Yeah, I would love to see that in just like maternal care during pregnancy, because I think now we're getting better ways to filter out who might be predisposed to postpartum depression a little bit more. Might as well put that together, because I can't imagine that not feeling great about yourself and doing a high social comparison. I'm sure that probably could contribute. There's got to be a correlation there with postpartum depression, I would think. Was there a minimum amount of time that somebody in the study would need to be engaged with social media to be included, or?
So for this, we did ask our participants about like what social media they use and how much time they spend on it. And we didn't find a whole lot in terms of differences based on like how much time they spend on social media within our study. Now that's kind of a hard thing to measure because you're asking someone to like reflect on
Self-report.
how much time they spend on social media. And we probably all spend a lot more time than we realize.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a hard thing to measure. And it's hard to, consider the differences between like a controlled experiment like this and then seeing posts in the real world.
Right.
I think, if you were to see more of this type of content, it is more likely to have more of an effect. But we weren't able to like capture that in the study because they were all seeing the same amount of posts. And we were just asking like generally how much time they spend on social media, not how much of that time was spent looking at motherhood content or making comparisons to motherhood content. So if we were able to measure that, then I think there might have been more there.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. And we had kind of chatted a little bit before I asked you to come on the show, where a lot of, I think, my interest and where I've had to have these conversations with patients is there's so much, and again, it's the algorithm, comparison beyond clothes, resources, breastfeeding, preschool, beyond that to return to activity, return to run, return to lifting, comparison with pelvic floor symptoms, prolapse, things like that, which I think probably would be a whole nother rabbit hole for you to dive down. Any thoughts that there might be, some similarities in there, what differences there might be there too, if you were to kind of dive into that? Not that I'm giving you work to do, but
no, these are such great questions, and I'm all for getting more ideas of what to be doing. I'm actually working with 2 other researchers right now, kind of related to what you're talking about here, looking at like body image portrayals postpartum.
Yes.
So like this like body positivity movement that exists on like Instagram and TikTok versus the moms that go online and show themselves getting right back into shape right away. Like I didn't need recovery and look at my abs. They're already back. And the baby doesn't stop me from getting in shape. And so we just collected data and are analyzing that to see the effects that has on newly postpartum moms in terms of like their body satisfaction and how they feel about themselves. But yeah, coming from more of like the pelvic floor standpoint, I think that's a really important, interesting area to study too, because people love to go online and talk about their personal experiences, which is great to some degree. And I actually do a lot of research outside of the motherhood context, looking at the effects of expert sources like physicians sharing information versus peers sharing information. I'm really interested in that dynamic.
Talk to me about that.
So I actually just had a study accepted about how young women are using TikTok to get health information.
Yes.
And I asked questions about those 2 different source types. And it was actually, I'd say, promising, the results. The young women are definitely getting health information from both, from their peers, people like them who have no credentials or no, expertise to be sharing the information they're sharing. But also from doctors. And in the study, they talked about how they prefer to get health information from medical professionals and that they are more likely to follow the information that they get from them. But there is still a big interest in wanting information from peers too. And I think that kind of goes back to that relatability standpoint of like, this person's going through the same thing as me. Like they understand, they get it. I can learn from their experience. And most of the research I've done, which is across a lot of different contexts, the doctors and information coming from them does outperform the peers in terms of like the positive effects. But there are some cases in which that's not true. So for instance, part of my research has looked at recruiting more minority populations to clinical trials. And so in that case, being able to hear about clinical trial experiences from, let's say, an African-American peer, when you're an African-American, can have a lot more influence than hearing about it from a doctor. And, that stems back to issues with historical mistreatment of that population in medical setting. So it makes sense that, a peer source and getting to hear their testimony of what it was like to go through that would hold a lot of value and have more of an effect. But yeah, so back to the prolapse thing and the pelvic floor health and postpartum recovery, I think it's very easy to see one narrative on social media and have it affect you, even if it might not be a narrative that's representative of most people's experiences.
Yeah.
And so that can be harmful, especially too when it's something like prolapse that a lot of people don't know about until they have to know about it. And so social media can be great in kind of tuning people into things, but it can also cause a lot of fear. It can cause you to change your behavior so that you can try to avoid having something like that happen to you. But then it also creates these unrealistic expectations of what your experience is going to be like postpartum.
Yeah. And all of this stuff I'm thinking about, my field in particular, I think has totally embraced social media. We have a lot of really excited, young pelvic floor physical therapists, far more than we had when I was, getting into the field 25 years ago. And they are passionate and they're excited and they want to share information. And I think there's that, and there's some nuances with that. And then there's also the influencer who happens to get pregnant and now all of a sudden they're selling a course, or, follow me for tips on, I'm like, okay, you've got no medical background. And then there's also a third group that like goes out and gets like a weekend education and then says that they know all this stuff. And so I think it's really hard to even vet information as the public. But to go back to us, I'll speak to pelvic floor PTs. I think there's two things. There's education, and then there's entertainment, which is basically social media, period. What happens when the goal of the provider is to entertain and get views over actually providing good, accurate information?
Yes, that's tough. You hope that, they can do both, right? Like talk about it in a way that captures attention, but also shares information. But yeah, I don't always see that. Well, first of all, though, I think the fact that so many people in your field are going to social media and utilizing it is huge and so amazing, because the research shows that people are going online to get health information on TikTok. And so the fact that there are credible people who have the knowledge and expertise and are meeting them there and having that content in existence when they go to look for it is huge. Like that makes a big difference. And then also just knowing too, like within this area of like sexual health and pelvic floor issues, I think it's especially important because those are topics that we don't always feel like super confident bringing up in person to our healthcare providers or to other people, or even like Googling certain things.
Right.
But so social media kind of knocks down that barrier too, and helps to kind of overcome the stigma and discomfort in looking up certain things. And so I think it's especially important in this field. But the research also shows that the typical like TikTok user or social media user has a really hard time in being able to identify who is actually credentialed. And it's so easy on TikTok too, to just like throw on some scrubs or, a medical jacket, make yourself look like a doctor, make your username have some credentials in it. And people aren't going to be able to differentiate in most cases that is not actually a trusted source.
So what's funny about that? A colleague of mine, I've watched her, and she does most of her stuff online. I have watched her change her wardrobe to now she is, and it's funny because she almost looks exactly like a menopause expert physician. They're almost identical. It's actually really funny. Scrub top, dark glasses. And I'm like, I don't think you actually wear glasses. I need these things to see you right now. So that's why we're doing this, because I'm 48 and we need them. No, but I've seen, and I think that's an interesting thing too, is like those of us trying to get our information out, like you need to get attention. So how do you do that? Can you make good information sexy, or are you just going to go for the entertainment factor? And it's so funny, especially in our field, I find there's pelvic floor PTs. And again, I find this like, it's good news, bad news, because I come from a time where there weren't many of us, and now there's a ton. And some of them have these huge accounts and huge followings. And again, we don't know how they got there. But like, they've only been out like a year or two. And I'm like, there's no way that you have any idea other than base training.
Right.
And so on one hand, I'm like, yes, I'm glad you're getting information out. But I'm like, ooh. So it's like kind of a double-edged sword. And I kind of feel like an old lady in that respect, because I'm like, but at the same time, I'm like, yay, I'm glad we're doing something. So I don't know if you're the average person. So like, let's take you, for example, knowing what you know about social media, knowing what you know about pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum, that kind of stuff too. Like, what can we tell moms to do? One, to keep their mental health safe, and two, to identify good sources of information.
Yeah. Okay. So let's first tackle the like comparison issue.
Okay.
So when it comes to that, I think my biggest tips are you've got to kind of like recognize how you're feeling when you see certain people and certain posts. So if there's an influencer that you follow and they always make you feel real shitty about your own life, unfollow them. Like, I know it's easier said than done, but there are some people who like their content is just very interesting to look at, but I feel terrible every time I see it because it's not what my life looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to recognize that is one good step.
Purge
Another
it.
thing, yes. Follow like a mixture of people too. So there's some influencers, especially here lately, who do an amazing job of talking about motherhood in a more realistic way.
Yes.
So having a mix of that, so that while you may see some of that idealized content, you're also getting reminders of like, okay, this is what things are really like. I'm not the only one who gets overwhelmed and breaks down and might scream at my kid and then regret it. So having that weaved in can help.
Okay.
Avoiding looking at social media first thing in the morning and last thing before you go to bed. So hard to do, right? Like that's most of our routines, right? We wake up, we look at our phone, we scroll something before we go to bed. But if you're doing that first thing in the morning, then that can set the tone for your day. Like maybe you were going to have a great or average day, but you got on social media and you see something that affects your mental health. That can carry on then and just kind of start your day off on a rough note. Likewise, if it's the last thing you see before you go to bed, then that can be a big issue too, especially because when we're tired, we're more vulnerable. We may have a harder time falling asleep because now we have this anxiety and we're overthinking our own parenting and our own experiences. And so trying to avoid those 2 times of day can make a big difference too. And then just remembering that like we have a life outside of social media. So we need to have those real life conversations too, and like spend time with other moms in real life and get reminders of, you know, what we all go through and that we can relate to each other. So those are kind of my tips there. In terms of trying to decipher what social media influencers or sources are credible and worth paying attention to, I think this is tough. You know, there's things we can do like looking for those cues of how credible someone is, but that's not enough. Just because someone has MD next to their name or they're wearing a stethoscope around their neck,
right,
isn't enough to just put your full trust in them. So dig a little deeper, you know, especially if it's something that like you're really interested in or that's related to something that you're concerned about. You know, maybe you're going to change your behaviors because of something you're going through. You're trying to overcome prolapse symptoms, whatever it may be. Dig a little deeper and try to figure out who that person is outside of that one video or outside of their one TikTok account. So, you know, Google their name, see what else comes up. Do they actually have a medical degree? How long have they been practicing? What is their area of expertise, their specialization? Trying to figure out, okay, do these credentials go beyond just the handle that anyone can manipulate on TikTok? So that's a good place to start. Also looking at, you know, content beyond just them. So is this something that only they are saying or that other healthcare professionals also are communicating about, and how does that communication differ from one professional to another is important. And I think just, you know, looking at the bigger picture, you know, don't don't get sucked into one video and believe it automatically.
Yeah.
But think about who they are, what credentials they have, what biases they might have, why they're posting. Is it something where they're getting paid to put this content out?
Yeah.
Especially in the case of they're showing you this really cool new product that you should be using to reduce your symptoms. Okay, are they showing you that because there's a lot of research and evidence that it makes a difference and they're using it with their patients and seeing a big difference? Or is it because they're getting money
Yeah.
to show that product to you?
Yeah.
So trying to be a little critical of why they're posting what they're posting can go a long way too.
Yeah. And I think also understanding your own motivation. Are you following that person to be entertained? Or are you following them to be educated? And sometimes it's a little bit of both. I mean, I know as a content creator, I can't learn without being entertained. So there's got to be a mix of that. But I do think that, if you're following that person because it's mostly, they're a little outlandish or, it's more entertainment. I think that's fine. But we don't necessarily need to take what they say as gospel either. So
Yeah, it's unfortunate that, so many social media algorithms prioritize and reward the content that's just, trendy,
Mhm.
whatever the challenge
Right.
is, the trend is at the moment, the trending song or whatever,
Right.
That's why people hop onto that, is because it helps them to grow their following, which
Right.
then helps them to monetize their account. And so it all goes back to kind of understanding their intentions and, like you said, your
Right.
intentions and how those things kind of work
Yeah.
together.
Well, and again, I think a lot of people don't understand the reasons why people make a post. And again, that goes back to your expertise of marketing is essentially most of the stuff out there isn't like, hey, this is just what's going on with my life. I'm just sharing it just to share it. Like there's a reason behind it. They're sharing this with you because they're either trying to get something from you or like not, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just important to be aware of the person that you're following has a motivation to share that information with you. And as long as you understand what it is and you're cool with it, great, that's fine. But it's not always out of the goodness of their heart.
Sure. Definitely.
I'm thinking, do you know if that comparison kind of falls through in other aspects of life? I'm thinking, I mean, body image, it must. I'm thinking kind of as kids are getting older, and what school do you go to? What sports are you into? What college did your kids get into? I have to believe that if you get this figured out and know what your tendencies are and how to manage that, it's going to be a skill that's going to be helpful throughout motherhood. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I hope so. I haven't actually, researched that aspect myself yet, hopefully down the road. Right now I've been focused on kind of the newer moms in terms of, when we're just getting used to this idea of motherhood and having a child in those early years when we are, especially vulnerable. But I think that if we can help to mitigate the issue in those beginning years, that hopefully will carry on and play a
Yeah.
role. But at the same time, mothers just in nature are competitive to some degree. And like I said, we all make social comparisons, and it's going to continue to be a part of our everyday lives and what we do. But I think there is potential there for this to carry on and help us as we progress through those later stages of motherhood when we are comparing, not when my child starts walking, but what college my student got into or my
Yeah.
child got into.
Yeah.
So
It
yeah,
gets crazier the older they get, trust me.
can't
All
wait.
right. So for you, you're expecting another one now. How has your research influenced kind of how you kind of use social media, how you spend your time with it, and kind of what you think you might do this next time around?
Yeah, so I think it was such a crazy time when I became a mother because it was COVID, and everything was still very much on lockdown when my
Mhm.
son was born, and so I think social media, just in general, was playing an even bigger role in my life then because we weren't leaving our homes. We weren't,
Right.
spending time with other mothers and friends and kids, and so I think I was on social media more than just by nature of the pandemic and
Mhm.
COVID-19. But I think kind of knowing what I know now, both from my experience as a mother and through my research, regardless of what's going on with the pandemic, I think I find myself trying to spend more time just in the real world and less time online,
Yeah.
and having a mixture of what I am following, and talking about it with my other mom friends. We send each other Instagram reels and TikTok videos, but the stuff we're sending is the stuff that we can relate to, that's more realistic. Some of it's, happy, funny videos. Some of it's more sentimental or like videos that, make us feel a certain way. But it's stuff that we can relate to and help us to see like, okay, this is how this video is affecting me, and it's affecting my friends the same way, and we talk about it. And I think that's been kind of the coolest part about this research, is just how many moms, both that are friends of mine, but also mothers that I don't know, reach out to me and are so thankful that this research is being done, because they can relate. Like, they're like, this is absolutely like true. Like, this is what I'm experiencing. And so seeing just the fact that these findings are out there now and other mothers are like, yes, like you're validating what I'm going through is really cool. And I think helps all mothers to see like, okay, we're all in this together. We're all being affected in this way. We all have to be a little more considerate about what we're posting online, what we're seeing online. It's also changed the way I post on social media. So I think it's really hard to not glamorize motherhood in a way, because we all in nature, we want to show the cute pictures, we want the happy times, and that's the stuff that we want to show up in the future. When social media shows us what we posted 5 years ago, we want to be remembering those good times and reminded of that. And that's probably the stuff that our kids are going to be glad we shared, rather than like them crying on the floor, or I once posted like my son throwing his hat in the toilet instead of like getting ready to go to daycare, but I try to have a balance now of not just posting all of the happy stuff, but also posting about some of our hard times too. So my son will be 4 tomorrow, actually.
Happy birthday.
And he has a diagnosis of autism. And so that's been a whole other layer for us too, in that when I was making these comparisons, part of what I was experiencing was like, my kid is a lot different, not responding to his name like he should be at this point. He's not talking like all of the other 3-year-olds that are showing up on my social media feeds. And so that was a whole other dynamic of comparison too. But I've used social media to kind of talk about those feelings that have come with that experience for me and the challenges that we're navigating with him. And so that's kind of helped, I think, provide that openness that, if other moms see that content from me and are going through the same thing and want to talk about it, like I want to talk about it, like talking to others and seeing that I'm not alone has a lot of positive effects on me. And I think we can also think about social media too, in terms of like the posts that, on Instagram live on our account forever, but then also the story feature where we can show like glimpses of our life that are just going to be on there, momentarily. Like anything you put online could live on forever, hypothetically. But, using that as an opportunity to show some of the more realistic images too, and not taking the time to edit and move all the clutter out before you take it. Just let it be and just capture the moment. So it's changed how I view social media, but also how I post on social media myself too.
Yeah. I do feel like I'd be curious your opinion. I do feel like there's been a shift towards more organic, authentic posting, as opposed to like the filter and the perfect picture. And I feel like in general that shifted. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yes, I would. I think since I did this Instagram research, short form video, so Instagram Reels, TikTok videos has really taken off. And that's where social media is at. And I think it's a great thing, because I think that has contributed to these more realistic portrayals. It's a lot easier to edit one static photo where you're able to decide exactly what's shown in that one clip and add all the features and edits and filters that you want. Whereas with a video, it's a lot harder to get everything to look perfect. And so I think that contributes. And I think there's also just a realization among a lot of mothers that like, we got to do better. Like, let's show the real stuff. And so there's a push, especially from some people, to talk about the harder times. And some people even go online and talk about social comparison, which I think is awesome, mothers sharing their experience of how social comparison is hurting them and affecting them and how they've noticed it in their lives. And so being able to see that is really awesome. And I think video makes it so that people can share more about their experiences in a really simple, easy way. And TikTok too, especially, it's kind of known for being more raw, unprofessional, like you just go for it.
Right.
Really cool too. So I think there's a lot of different factors that are all ultimately helping to bring more of a realistic view to motherhood online, which I love to see.
Yeah. No, I think that's a trend. Another like weird offshoot is I do see people that it's almost, I don't know if you saw this trend. It was probably like a month or two ago. We're like social media is fake. And then they were quote vulnerable about certain things. And it was really not vulnerable. And I'm like, come on.
Yeah.
You're giving me the glamorized vulnerability here. Like, don't feel the need to do that either. And I'm like, oh, are we doing this again?
The trends.
So, if you're going to tell me things are crappy, tell me things are crappy. Don't tell me the sugar. It's like the whole thing. Like, what's your biggest weakness in a job interview? And then you tell them like some perverted
I'm
form
a
of like,
perfectionist.
I care too much. Like, no.
Yes, absolutely.
Forever the perfectionists. Oh my goodness. All right. At the end of every episode, we ask a couple of questions. What is a book you're reading or podcast you're listening to right now?
Yeah, gosh. So most recently I started listening to the Autism Dad podcast. So that goes back to me having a son with autism and looking for the experiences of other parents. But he's a single dad to multiple kids with autism and just talks about their experiences. And I stumbled across him on social media, and he put out an episode that was especially moving to me about the memory his son, who's now like 15, had before he was able to communicate. So my son is mostly nonverbal, and it's really hard for my husband and I to know like how much he understands what's going on in that brain of his. And so in this one episode, his son talks about how he was like in preschool and couldn't verbally communicate, but he was like understanding things.
Yeah.
He like has a memory of like trying to communicate but being unable to. And so I think that had like a lot of value for me in trying to understand what things might be like for my child.
Yeah.
But I mean, autism is such a complex thing that's different for each individual. I think that podcast, though, has been a really good tool in terms of like feeling less alone in the experience and getting a better understanding of things. He has a lot of tips from his experiences, but also professionals. And it's just a good resource, I think, even if you don't have a kid with autism, to try to get a better understanding of that world. So I really, really loved that. I'm also a big Hidden Brain fan.
Oh, yes. That's a good one.
That's and me love to, hear about all the cool things that are covered on that one.
Yeah, no, I do. I feel like podcasts were in like a long time ago, and then they were out, and they're totally back in again. And I will listen to them on my long runs now, and because otherwise there's just too much to listen to. I can't get through the day.
Yes.
All right, favorite activity since becoming a mom?
Oh man, that's a tough one. Especially with summer coming up, I'd probably say taking my son swimming. He loves the water, which is a little terrifying in some ways, but yeah, when we go swimming at like the local pool, he is just so excited and elated.
That's awesome.
And it's just kind of a special bonding moment because just in life, he tends to have like a very short attention span. He's very into like movies and watching TV shows, and it can be hard to engage with him with his autism. But when it comes to swimming, like he needs me there. And, we're like in the pool together, and he's very in tune with me, and I feel like we can connect a little bit more, and he's just so happy that.
Aw.
Really
Is it pool season there yet?
Not quite. I think that the timing of the second baby is going to kind of ruin that this summer because it's going to be a little hard to swim, but we'll at least have like a little pool in the backyard for
That
him.
sounds good. Yeah, that's where I was with my second. I was obscenely pregnant at the end of the summer, and my son was 2.5, and we have lots of pictures of him buck naked in the kiddie pool in the driveway. So because I was not doing anything. Great memories, and both kids love the pool, which is great. So
good.
All right, one piece of advice for moms.
Oh man, so many things come to mind, but I think I'm going to go with rely on the other mothers in your life. So this is kind of a weird thing to talk about when we've talked about like not comparing yourself to other moms, but the moms that you have as friends who get it. I think motherhood is one of those things that before you experience it, you can try to prepare as much as possible. You can try to get an idea of what it's going to be like, but you don't know what it's like to be a mom until you've been a mom.
Yep.
And so I think if you can have a community around you of other mothers who get it and who can be the person you go to when you need to vent, when you need to brag, when you need to cry, like having other moms who relate to the experiences, I think can be such an important thing, especially for your mental health and just getting through the day-to-day struggles that come with motherhood. I'm really, really lucky to have a lot of mom friends in my life that, I was friends with before we became moms, and it was cool to get to become moms together, but also I've connected to other mothers through my research or through my experience of being a parent to a child with special needs, and getting to have those connections and people that I can rely on as kind of like resources makes a big deal. So, create your own community and find those people that you can really confide in and be yourself with and be vulnerable and talk about what you're feeling. Because a lot of the times they can make you feel better about things.
Yeah, no, I'm sure what was the outpouring like when the study hit kind of mainstream media? Like, was your inbox completely slammed or?
Yes, yeah. Both by, people who I don't know, but then also like my friends, like being so excited, like, oh my gosh, like you're such a rock star and you're doing this while pregnant, and how cool for your daughter to get to be a part of this and see you do this cool stuff when you are bringing her into this world. And so I think that's really cool. But a lot of people just, take an interest in this because it's something that a lot of people relate to and are excited to see out there.
Yeah,
So.
no, I love that. And clearly you hit a chord. All right. Who is somebody, and I usually ask this with obviously, pregnant postpartum clinicians, that sort of thing. Is there somebody kind of in your area of research that you've like gotten really interested in, or you think is doing some really cool work or things like that?
Yeah. So I have like great collaborators that I work with within this space, but I think for this, I'll mention maybe Jo Piazza, who actually, she's a journalist and she has a podcast called Under the Influence that is all about this phenomenon.
Okay.
And so I don't personally know her, but in getting into this area of research, stumbled across her podcast and became really interested in it. And so for anyone who's more interested in this, both from like a historical standpoint, a marketing standpoint of like why mothers do this, she talks about kind of like the good and bad of influencers within this motherhood space. And it's really interesting. And then I'd also just give a shout out to like the moms on social media who are trying to change things out. Like they're not like studying this, but they're recognizing what's going on and they're trying to make a difference. So there's some really cool moms on TikTok, or even Facebook, depending on wherever you're at on social media, that you can follow to kind of help get some comedic relief. Some of them like, I just yelled at my kids, but here we are, making cookies, everything's great, like talking about that balance. But then also there's some who approach it in a more like vulnerable way too. Like will film themselves having, a really rough experience and talking about the emotions that they're feeling. So those moms are awesome. And I think those are the people that, we want to follow and support.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. All right. Last one here. What does it mean to you to be an active mom?
Oh man. So we didn't really get into this, but I actually have a pretty bad bladder prolapse from my son's delivery. He did not want to come out, and my birth was forceps assisted, which was not fun at all. Hoping that this next one goes a lot smoother. But so that really had a lot of effects on my physical activity and mental health too, in my postpartum experience. And so for me, being an active mom means like getting to keep up with my son. He's very active, loves to climb, run, all the things. So being able to like walk with him to the park and chase him around and do the things that he wants to do, but also getting back to the things that I loved to do before I was a mom. I've been very lucky to have some amazing physical therapists in my life since going through that traumatic ordeal, that have helped me to kind of manage my symptoms and get back to things that I really liked doing before I had him. Things are definitely not the same, and there's certain exercises I'll probably never do again, but I've found a way to get back to being active and doing the things that help me, not only physically, but especially in terms of my mental health. So being able to keep up with my son, but also do the things that make me feel good is kind of what it means for me.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And thanks for sharing that. I know not everybody's open about those sorts of things, especially if this isn't your area of expertise. We tend to talk about it because this is what we do all day long. So it's no big deal for us. But good news is typically second time around, a lot easier. Most of my clients with prolapse issues, it's actually much, much, much easier the second time around. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for you.
We've got to normalize prolapse. We've got to normalize it. We've got to talk about it, because when I didn't know what the heck was going on with my body, I had never heard of prolapse before. And my OB, when I brought it up to her, literally said, "Oh, you don't have to worry. That doesn't happen until you're like in your 50s. And there I was, 20 something years old, and it had definitely happened to me. And so I think it's important that we normalize it, especially among younger moms.
Yeah, definitely. And I look at that and I'm like, what? Because the primary reason for people to have prolapse isn't age, it's parity. It's you had a kid. So, all right. So I'm going to plan your whole research agenda after your next baby's born.
In touch. Give me all your ideas.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said there. I think there's a lot of opportunity for some good research, and kind of understanding not only the information's available, but like why is your doctor telling you things that aren't true? But I mean, nothing to do with marketing, but I digress. All right. Well, either way, you've got some pelvic PTs in your corner. You've got us now if you need us. But thank you so much for kind of sharing that information. You're a little bit of a unique guest for us, but I thought it was such a relevant part of so many of the conversations that we have as moms, that I'm so glad that there's a mom doing the research and trying to help us figure out whether we're more predisposed and to make life a little bit easier, because Lord knows we could use that. So
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. And, the more people I can get these out to, the better. So I'm really excited.
Absolutely.
The conversations you have and the work you're doing is so important, as a mom and as someone who has been in need of the type of work that you do. So thank you for this opportunity as well.
Absolutely. And if you want to know which prolapse accounts, I can point you to the good ones.
Send them my way.
If you guys want to know more about CIERA's research, you can find her at Dr._CIERA_K on Instagram. I don't know TikTok because I really can't. I don't have time for that. I don't. And if it's going to go away anyway, good riddance. Anyway, point being, thank you so much for being on the show, and good luck on this next delivery. Did you enjoy the podcast? If so, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and tell a friend to do the same. Are you a postpartum mom or postpartum pro wanting to know more about getting back to running after baby? Check out all my free goodies on KerryPagliano.com. This podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Carrie Pagliano and her guests to the show. The content should not be taken as medical advice and is for entertainment purposes only. Always consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions.